record this one. All right. Good evening. We are thrilled to welcome you all to Dr. Malina Buturovic's talk, The Transmission of Fault, Heredity as Problem of Theodicy. Dr. Buturovic received her B of A at Yale 2016 and Ph.D. at Princeton 2023 in Classics and Interdisciplinary Humanities. In fall of 2023, she returned to Yale as a postdoctoral fellow and now assistant professor in the Department of Classics. She is an intellectual historian of the Greek imperial world with a particular interest in the period's close entanglements between medicine, Middle Platonism, and theology. Dr. Buturovic's current projects include a monograph on heredity in Plutarch and Galen, an article on embodiment and afterlife theology, and a paper on modern anthropology and ancient kinship. She also has interests in the reception of Greek tragedy and the tradition of Greco-Roman physiognomy, similarly oriented towards methodological and conceptual challenges of studying the history of the body. Join me, please, in welcoming Malina Buturovic.
Thanks so much, Alyssa, for having me today. And I should say that in addition to our professional association, Alyssa and I go way back. So it's a special pleasure for that reason. I also have to embarrass someone else in the audience, which is just to say that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about bad parents in my talk today, but my own very nice parents are not only here, but have brought some of their friends too. So if I get any particularly funny questions from that side of the room, that's who's to blame. Okay, so my talk today is going to be about, the basic problem is this: what place does a principle of hereditary resemblance have in a just and well-ordered natural world? So from the earliest Greek poetry on, we find in ancient writings the idea that offspring usually resemble their parents. This resemblance seems to span both physical and psychological characteristics, appearance, and personality. But for ancient thinkers, like many are, who are committed to the divine oversight of the natural world, the idea of systematic hereditary resemblance is not a straightforwardly good one. It does not seem like an especially good idea on the part of an intelligent designer to assure the transmission not only of good characteristics from parent to child, but of bad characteristics as well. Why would God or nature or the demiurge repeat errors with each generation in this way? Why not wipe the slate clean? So my discussion today is going to range between explorations of this problem in three famous authors of classical antiquity. First is the late 8th century BCE Greek poet Hesiod, about whom I'll say more in a moment, and then two thinkers of the 1st to 2nd century CE, so the Roman Greek world. The first of these is Plutarch. So Plutarch is a priest. He was living in Roman Greece in Boeotia. He's best known for a set of biographies of figures from early Greek and early Roman history arranged in sets, the parallel lives. But in addition to that, he was also a philosopher with profound interests in Plato, science, medicine, and earlier Greek literature. The second of these figures is Galen, a 2nd century CE physician. So he lived in Pergamon, shown here in Asia Minor. He was an enormously prolific author. He wrote about 1/8 of extant ancient Greek texts. And I suspect that many people in this audience, for different reasons, Okay, awesome. So many people will probably know his name. Galen was an enormously influential doctor in antiquity, and about 4 centuries after his death, a process began by which his works were translated first into Syriac, then into Arabic, and later in sort of the 10th and 11th centuries back into Latin, where they became the basis for the first curricula of the European medical schools. So an enormously influential figure in the history of medicine. So I'll talk a little bit about Hesiod. Here's another picture of Pergamon. I just give you these because they're beautiful. So my main point today is going to be about Galen, and an argument about how Galen solves this problem of heredity. Namely, I'll argue that he picks up a set of anxieties from his broader cultural milieu over bad heredity, but he reinterprets these instead as cases of errant human agency. So in Galen's vision, the regular occurrence of bad heredity, the transmission of bad characteristics from parents to children, reflects human beings' systematic tendency towards misbehavior and wrongdoing as thinking moral agents, rather than any material fact about the structure of the natural world or the mechanics of generation. What's interesting and significant about this argument? Well, lying behind it is a larger argument that the problem of ancestral fault, so the idea that God would punish descendants for their ancestors' wrongdoing in ancient poetry and theology, is closely entangled with the problem of heredity in ancient medicine and biology. In my larger project, I argue that medicine and theology converge around an overlapping interest in the transmission of fault, the various ways that offspring carry consequences for their ancestors' actions on their bodies. And while the problem of the transmission of fault is wider than this, in today's talk, I want to focus on one crucial aspect of it, the problem of when you have sex to conceive. The problem of timing conception, or of the kairos sunesias, plays an extremely prominent role in literary, theological, medical, and biological works, essentially from the 8th century BCE well into the medieval world. And it's intimately linked to the kind of theological thinking about heredity that I introduced at the opening. So in part one of the talk, I'll briefly introduce you to the problem of the kairos sunesias by talking a little bit about Plutarch. And then in section 2, I'll give you some background on Galen's theology and how it shapes his thinking about heredity. And in the final section, I'll suggest how Galen solves the problem of heredity and the ways in which in doing so, he offers an expansive vision of human agency and responsibility. So Hesiod's Works and Days, this 8th century BCE poem, is a poem in which the speaker advises his brother on how to be a successful farmer and a just person. And it has what is perhaps the most famous discussion in all of Greco-Roman literature of ancestral fault, God's punishment of offspring. In a long account of the punishments that the unjust man will suffer, the speaker of the poem describes the consequences that the offspring of a perjurer, so someone who violates an oath, will suffer as follows. He who willingly lies, having sworn an oath, if he has damaged justice and he is damaged irreparably, the lineage that is left behind to him for the future is more obscure than it would otherwise be, whereas the lineage of the man who keeps his oath in the future is better. So these lines fit within the poem's broader agenda of thinking about fertility, reproduction, and heredity as important sites of human vulnerability to divine punishment and reward. In a later passage, Hesiod observes that in the household of the just man, the women give birth to children resembling their parents. In both these passages, what seems to lie behind the phenomenon of intergenerational resemblance is a principle of justice. Thanks to divine intervention, parents receive precisely the offspring they deserve. Good parents are rewarded by good offspring, and bad parents are punished by bad offspring. So this is my Hesiodic Punnett square. And the good mother, bad father cases are a little hazier, but I think Hesiod is primarily concerned about the virtue of the father. What's interesting, though, is that this is not the only reproductive advice that Hesiod hands out in Works and Days. So at the end of the poem, he gives a long string of prescriptions in which he says, this is the time at which you can do this action. This is the time at which you cannot do this action. And he's particularly interested in what times you can and cannot have sex to conceive. And one of the pieces of advice he gives is that you should not sow offspring when returning from an ill-omened funeral, but from a feast of the immortal gods. And on the face of it, this idea that you shouldn't sow offspring on your way home from a funeral doesn't seem to have a lot to do with the idea that being a bad person means you'll be punished with bad offspring. But there is an interesting twist here. Namely, when Plutarch comes along and reads Hesiod about 800 years later, he runs these different kinds of Hesiodic advice together. And on Plutarch's reading, both Hesiod's ideas about divine punishment and his assessment of the kairos sunesias, so his idea that you should not sow offspring on the way home from a funeral, are based on the same underlying theory. Namely, that there is a bodily transmission of what the Greeks call pathos from parents to children at conception. So the Greek word pathos is very difficult to translate. Sometimes people translate it as passion or affection, but what it basically means is whatever is suffered or experienced. So it can refer to a disease or a really strong emotion. And so the idea is whatever the parents suffer or experience at the moment of conception, they will pass on to their children. If you're drunk, you're going to pass foolishness on to your children. If you're in a really good mood, you're going to pass jovial character, personality on to your children. This is not an idea that we find attested clearly anywhere in Hesiod's time, but by the time you get to Plutarch, it is the dominant science of heredity of the day. Okay, this idea probably seems really strange, right? because what it does is it runs together two things that we normally think of as different, namely character heredity on the one hand. So if the parent is greedy, oh, the child's going to turn out greedy, and the transmission to children of passing emotions felt by the parents at the moment of conception, sorrow and joy and every affection. This kind of conflation, though, is very common in pre-modern theories of heredity, both ancient and medieval. These so-called soft theories of heredity do not mark a distinction between inheriting your mother's habitual happiness and her chance elation at the moment of conception. So they don't distinguish what we would today call congenital influences, influences from parents' behavior and prenatal environment, from what we would today call hereditary influences, those influences which result from the parents' kind of genetic material, their fundamental natures. So as a consequence, these soft theories lay heavy emphasis on the chirosynesias. In regulating the chirosynesias, they try to achieve a sort of genetic engineering, managing which pathe, which affections are passed on to the offspring and which are not. If you are drunk at conception, you pass on foolishness. If you are happy, a joyful disposition. If you're on the way home from a funeral, a habitually sorrowful and morose disposition. So Plutarch's thinking when he's reading Hesiod is characteristic of this. What makes this interesting is that it means that he is able to link together Hesiod's ideas about divine punishment of the perjurer with Hesiod's ideas about the appropriate moment for conception. So on the one hand, he thinks there needs to be divine punishment of the offspring of the perjurer because the perjurer will have passed on all of his bad pathe to the children. And so God needs to intervene and prevent those bad pathe from flourishing into wickedness. On the other hand, he thinks that you should not conceive on the way home from a funeral, because on the way home from a funeral, you're going to be in a really bad mood and your child is going to inherit that bad mood. And so these two ideas, which in Hesiod look like they're totally disconnected from each other, for Plutarch become part of one and the same theory of heredity. So I should be clear that Plutarch is reading really imaginatively here, right? He's interpolating the science and medicine of his own time into what would have been for him 800-year-old poetry. It's a bit as though I were now to read Shakespeare in order to draw conclusions about genetics and DNA. And here's one way I think of seeing the gap between Hesiod and Plutarch. Hesiod interprets intergenerational resemblance as itself a kind of rough justice, ensuring that each person receive their proper deserts. If you are a good person, you get good children. If you are a bad person, you get bad children. Plutarch, on the other hand, sees a more complicated relationship between nature and heredity and justice. So he says, to those whose natures were attracted to and admitted of the congenital trait, justice came, pursuing their resemblance of wickedness. There's a lot more I could say about this passage, but to briefly summarize, the idea looks like, well, there's a kind of unstoppable material transmission of whatever the parents suffer at conception to their offspring. But in extending illness or wickedness to the next generation in this way, God is able to cure otherwise incurable forms of wickedness because he has afforded a longer period of time in which to take action against them. So if you want, Hesiod's solution to heredity as a problem of theodicy is that heredity is itself an instrument of divine reward and punishment, in that bad parents get bad children. And Plutarch's solution is that, well, something material happens at the moment of conception. Through these processes of material tradition, a pathos is passed on from generation to generation, and then divine justice intervenes to cure through punishment the illness and wickedness of a family that would be incurable in the lifespan of a single individual. Galen is going to take a different line, though it has a relationship to both of these solutions. And that is what we will talk about now. So notwithstanding some important differences, Plutarch and Galen are both Platonists. They share a commitment to a world overseen by a providential guardian, devoted to order and justice. And both, therefore, have the problem of theodicy, which I outlined at the beginning of this paper, why in a well-ordered universe, a seeming natural law would assure the transmission of bad characteristics from generation to generation. For Plutarch, as we saw, bad heredity belongs in a just and well-ordered world, inasmuch as it goes hand in hand with the principle that offspring carry responsibility and especially liability to punishment for their ancestors' wrongdoing. And Galen is going to take things in a different direction. So the easiest way to see how Galen thinks through this problem is in a work called On the Usefulness of the Parts. In On the Usefulness of the Parts, Galen moves through each part of the body, explaining how the design and function of that part demonstrates the care and intelligence of the divine designer. And just to give you a sense of scale, the English translation of this book is in 2 volumes and runs over 700 pages. It talks about every one of your vertebrae, every part of your nose. Galen calls his intelligent designer either nature, physis, or the demiurge, demiurgus, and I'll use these terms interchangeably. And Galen's intelligent designer is extraordinarily skilled, but he's not omnipotent. Unlike the Jewish and Christian God, as Galen actually points out, he is constrained by the qualities and capacities of the matter on which he acts. So he can make some things out of some matter and other things out of other matter, but not everything out of every matter. So this commitment to the good order of the natural world organized by a demiurge means that Galen thinks a good deal about patterns of intergenerational resemblance and difference that structure the natural world, both at and below the level of the species. So in modern terms, about heredity. And within the picture Galen unfolds, heredity turns out to play a paradoxical role. Species heredity is one of the designer's great strokes of genius, responsible for upholding the good order of the natural world. Heredity at the level of the family or subspecies is a more ambivalent good. So I'll first talk a little bit about species heredity and then focus on the trickier problem of subspecies and family similarity and difference. So species heredity has an obvious explanation for Galen, namely different animals have different functions, so they need different bodies to suit those functions. So the idea every fish offspring of fish parents invariably turns out also to be a fish with the correct anatomy and behavior for its environment is for Galen basically the best possible indication, not only of the good order of the natural world, but also of the intelligence of the designer. And that's what he's after here when he says, when the fish tribe is so numerous, for the atoms not to forget and make feet or a neck in a single one of them is the work of an accurate memory. He's making fun of atomists who think that the world is made out of silly, crazy idea, right? The world is made out of atoms rather than being designed. Okay, so species differentiation on the one hand is one of the best proofs of the intelligence of the designer. Species immortality is the other of the best proofs of the intelligence of the designer. And there's an amazing passage here of which I'll read just part. He says, the works of nature have already endured for many thousands of years and will endure hereafter, for she has discovered a wonderful art whereby when an animal dies, she may always put a new one in its place. That is reproduction. One interesting thing, however, to note about both of these passages, the ones that celebrate the role of reproduction and generation in upholding the good order of the natural world, is that they focus on non-human animals rather than human beings. So they focus on fish, you saw in the first passage, and this one, if you kept reading, you would see that it's primarily about irrational animals. Okay, so far so good. That explains why we have species with different kinds of bodies. There's a further question about why within those species there seem to be further patterns of similarity and difference. So one part of Galen's answer to that is that the divine craftsman, however fantastic a craftsman he is, sometimes makes mistakes. And Galen has some harsh words for anyone who wants to hold those occasional mistakes against the demiurge. You, O most noble accuser of the works of nature, have no regard for any of these things, and see only that out of 10,000 times 10,000 men, she has made a single one with 6 fingers. If Polyclitus made one such small error in 1,000 statues, you yourself would not blame him, and you would say that his accusers had no judgment. So basically, Galen's point is, yes, once in a while, the demiurge makes an error, but his errors are extremely rare. He might make a person with 6 fingers once, or a person with 4 fingers once, rather than a person with 5 fingers, but his errors are extremely rare, way rarer than those of any expert human craftsman, as Polyclitus is. And also those errors never seriously impede function. So both in Galen's discussion here and in another place where he talks about these errors, he's very clear that they're primarily recognizable as errors because they are rare, not because they are prima facie any worse. Okay. So that's another way you might get congenital similarity and difference. Errors of the divine craftsman, however, will not explain the systematic patterns of similarity and difference below the level of the species, at the level of the family. And these, it turns out, have to do with matter and the relationship of Galen's demiurge to matter. So the most famous passage describing the relationship between the matter and the demiurge is one in which Galen compares the demiurge to a farmer. The demiurge plants and cultivates his crops, Galen explains, but the soil in which he plants them also plays an important role in how they turn out. Um, so on the one hand, the designer is able to work with quite a wide range of matter, just as all soil except that which is very poor is the object of the farmer's skill. So too, every healthful temperament of the body admits the skill of the creator of animals. On the other hand, his powers are not without limit. He cannot make a horse out of beef or of ashes. So as a consequence of this model of divine involvement in the natural world, where there's always a compromise going on between the demiurge and matter, every part of the body has what Galen calls a twofold generation. It is the way it is because of the plans of the designer and because of the nature of the place, the characteristics of the matter from which it is made. Different parts of the body are explicable in terms of divine design versus matter to differing degrees. So the hair on the head, for instance, is a carefully cultivated product of divine design. These are seeds that the demiurge planted in matter and watered and watched grow. But the hair in the armpits and pubic regions is more like a weed. It sprouts spontaneously because of the nature of this place. In this case, just like in the case of the weeds, due to excessive moisture. And there's also a theory of human difference lurking in the background here, namely parts which are due to the nature of the place. So the kind of natural moistness of the matter in some part of your body, parts like armpit hair, tend to exhibit much more variation between different families and racial groups than parts which are essential to the divine plan. This is crucial to Galen's picture. One of the promises of Galen's system of teleology seems to be that human beings are always made from broadly the right kind of matter. Some matter may be easier or harder for the demiurge to work with, but the seed from which human beings are made must be matter which is broadly suitable for the making of human beings. So, Galen has given us a couple of ways of thinking about patterns of similarity and dissimilarity that structure the natural world in UP. Differences between animal species are central to nature's design. Below the level of the species, there are extremely uncommon congenital errors of formation on the part of the divine craftsman. And there's also some variation introduced by different connate matter. So these two, the errors of the divine craftsman and variations in the connate matter, both tend to show up, especially in parts that are not really central to the divine design, so parts like armpit hair, and particular parts that don't interfere with a human being's function. Notice that there is no room for, say, hereditary disease or hereditary disability, or really any negative hereditary trait on this picture. And in fact, in his surviving corpus as a whole, which, as I said, is enormous, it looks like Galen doesn't have one single unambiguous discussion of a disease as hereditary. I want to suggest that Galen does actually have an account that covers instances of hereditary disease and bad hereditary. It just deliberately resists explaining these in terms of either a theory of material transmission or of the mechanics of generation. And the culprit here is going to turn out to be human error. Okay, so Galen on human generation. So the passage I'm going to turn to now, last thing we're looking at together, looks at first glance like it's an anxiety over congenital factors in general and not really over resemblance. But what I want to do is walk you through why I think it's actually a theory of heredity of sorts. So in the passage, Galen observes the various ways that human beings, as very careless generators of other human beings, betray the perfection of nature's design. He writes, "And yet how frequently in the fathers that beget and the mothers that bear us, it must be not error that is rare, but right doing. For those who are drunk consort with those who are drunk, and men that do not know their own whereabouts from repletion," this is from having eaten too much, "with women in the same state. Hence, in this way, the very beginning of our procreation is faulty, and then come the unspeakable errors of the pregnant woman, her indifference to proper exercise, her gluttony, passions, drunkenness, bathing, and untimely indulgence in love. This is not the way in which farmers sow wheat or barley or plant grapevines or olive trees. For first they see to it in advance that the soil to which they entrust their seeds shall be in good condition. And then they take no little care that the seed shall not be deluged with too much water and rot, or withered by droughts, or killed by frost." So this passage is a really unusual passage for On the Usefulness of the Parts. For most of the 800 pages On the Usefulness of the Parts, all that Galen does is celebrate the usefulness of the parts. He systematically avoids any mention of disease, of dysfunction, of why things might go wrong in the human body. And what he particularly avoids doing is basically what he does in this passage, which is observing that, notwithstanding the usefulness of the parts, actually most of the time something is going wrong in the human body, right? So that in fact, the kind of standard state of things is that things are not going nearly as well as they should be if the demiurge did his job as well as usefulness of the parts suggests that he did. And as you probably noticed, this passage offers a particularly striking contrast to the account of generation that I just read to you in, for instance, the discussion of the fish, or the discussion of how nature replaces one animal through another animal with the remarkable art of reproduction. Here, Galen treats at least human generation as a uniquely dangerous site for the transmission of illness and dysfunction, not an orderly site for the transmission of functional adaptation and guarantee of species immortality. Interestingly, though, this passage is clearly picking up on anxieties over bad heredity found in Galen's contemporaries, but what it's trying to do is understand the mechanism behind them in a different way. So in book 14, Galen repeats the claim that first the untimely intercourse of the male and female, so missing the chirosynesias, and later the regimen of the pregnant woman, are most often to blame when something goes wrong with the part of the animal. Galen's mention of kairos prescriptions and regimen here is a way of flagging a broad set of concerns, some of which we have already seen, over the potentially pathological congenital factors which human beings introduce into the process of generation. And Galen's concern for the chirosynesias tracks the worry we've already seen in Hesiod and Plutarch, and which is also found in lots of other ancient authors, Plato, Aristotle, and particularly a famous doctor and gynecologist, Serenus, whose work is our sort of most sweeping medical exploration of childbirth in the Roman world. And actually, Galen's language here extremely closely echoes a passage from Serenus's Gynecology, which advises on how you should decide the chirosynesias. So he says, in order that the offspring may not be rendered misshapen, women must be sober during coitus, because in drunkenness the soul becomes the victim of strange fantasies. This furthermore because the offspring bears some resemblance to the mother as well, not only in body but in soul. Therefore it is good that the offspring be made to resemble the soul when it is stable and not deranged by drunkenness. Indeed, it is utterly absurd that the farmer takes care not to throw seed upon very moist and flooded land, and that on the other hand, mankind assumes nature to achieve a good result in generation when seed is deposited in bodies which are very moist. So as we saw above, these kairos and regimen anxieties by the 2nd century CE are largely the province of medicine. They tend to cluster around considerations of male and female sexual maturity, regimen, the unspeakable errors of the pregnant woman, to quote Galen, and any possibility of a disturbed emotional state during conception or gestation, particularly drunkenness. For the most part, these worries over the chirosynesias and the regimen of the pregnant woman are anxieties over this transmission of pathos, right, as we saw above. So recall Plutarch's language in that passage that every pathos is transmitted at the moment of conception. And while in authors like Plutarch and Serenus, it sort of is a worry over congenital influence, it is really a case of what I introduced above as a soft theory of heredity. In many of the contexts in which they survive, kairos and regimen prescriptions are explicitly cashed out in terms of anxieties and language concerning resemblance. So in this passage, Serenus enjoins against the drunkenness of the mother during conception because the offspring will come to resemble the mother not only in body but in soul. And you can see I've given you the Greek words homoiotes, homoion. For Plutarch too, as we saw, the discussion of the chirosynesias shaded into an account of full-blown character heredity, spanning not only joy and pain, but also wickedness, virtue, and a whole range of other psychological characteristics. Among Galen's contemporaries, in short, there is a tendency to speak of all forms of material influence from parents on offspring as cases of intergenerational resemblance. So Galen may share these anxieties, but he does not understand the transmission of fault in the same way. For Galen, the interaction between demiurge and matter can produce some variation, but it can't produce any genuinely negative effects like hereditary disease or wickedness. Galen's system of teleology guarantees that the matter you receive from your parents, the connate matter, the matter in the seed that becomes the basis of the new body of the offspring, is always more or less the right kind of matter for the human being. Galen is really concerned to distinguish this providential gift, this gift from the demiurge of connate matter, from the kind of negative parental influence that he worries about here. So he takes on the belief in the significance of the chirosynesias and the regimen of the pregnant woman, found in Serenus and in Plutarch. He accepts these as important, maybe even as the main basis for what we would today call congenital disease and bad heredity. But he is very clear that these cases of the transmission of fault are matters of parental agency and parental, particularly maternal, mismanagement of regimen. They are the unnatural machinations of human beings as rational agents, not problems associated with the mechanics of generation. And you can see this from his language in the passage. So this language of hamartema, and I'll talk more about Salma in a moment, is very marked in the philosophy of Galen's period. Hamartema is a rational error as opposed to a pathos, which is a material problem. Galen, in short, systematically links bad heredity to poor rational calculations that human parents, particularly mothers, make, rather than to the mechanics of reproduction. So the summary of different forms of variation. So Galen tries in Usefulness of the Parts to reread a range of kairos and regimen anxieties typically associated with resemblance, instead as errors of human reason and agency. And we can say more about the nature of this agency if we think about how Galen's discussion here relates to his treatment of the two limitations of teleology laid out in section 2, the influence of matter and the errors of the divine craftsman. So it looks like Galen actually considers the errors of the human parents to be something like errors that the demiurge makes when he's constructing new creatures. Galen is interested in human errors, sphalma, and right-doing katarthoma. Both these words, but especially katarthoma, are rare in Galen's corpus, and their other uses are suggestive. The only other use of the word katarthoma in On the Usefulness of the Parts explicitly describes the excellence of divine craftsmanship. And in another text, Method of Healing, Galen refers to the errors of the divine craftsman using sphalmata. Under the auspices of these similarities, right, that human beings and the demiurge seem to make similar kinds of errors, the demiurge's creation and embryological creation also look really different. The demiurge can master almost any matter. In the Demiurge Farmer passage, Galen writes, just as all soil, except that which is very poor, is the object of the farmer's skill, so too every healthful temperament of the body admits the skill of the creator of animals. But human beings should and fail to be more cautious of the material circumstances in which they undertake embryological creation. So Galen says they really ought to see to it in advance that the soil to which they entrust their seed shall be in good condition. Human beings have something in common with the demiurge farmer, but they operate under vastly different constraints and with far less foresight and understanding. So whereas the demiurge's errors are few and far between, in the case of human beings, Galen says, it is not error that is rare, but any right conduct. On the one hand, then, each act of embryological creation by human parents has something divine about it. It's an aspect of divine creation and an echo of divine creation. But unlike divine creation, embryological creation is a continual site for the reintroduction of disease and evil into the world by careless human agents. In this light, embryological creation looks like a dark mimicry of the perfection of divine creation, made even less appealing to Galen by the very fact of its subtle play of analogy and disanalogy with divine work. The fundamental reason for this disanalogy is for Galen human beings' imperfection, not as matter, since the demiurge must also contend with forms of material intransigence, like excessive wetness, but as creators in their own right. Human beings are failure-prone demiurges. The concern over humans' godlike agency and all too human tendency to error is closely linked to a concern over how human beings mismanage their health in general, found across Galen's corpus. Besides the errors and perfections of divine creation, the other context in which Galen brings up the language of katarthoma and sphalma repeatedly is in the context of his treatise on regimen, hygiene, where the phrase correct the fault occurs 4 times in descriptions of how human beings should correct against their own excessive or ill-timed bathing and eating and drinking. So hygiene makes clear that these dangers of errant human agency span all kinds of behaviors, not only generation. But generation seems to have a particular grip on Galen's imagination as the only case that receives extensive, obsessive discussion in Galen's theological masterwork On the Usefulness of the Parts itself. It's in creating other human beings that human beings most manifestly play God. They thus fail not only themselves, but others when they choose poorly. In doing so, they make visible that their responsibility to the task of maintaining and upholding divine creation is wider than Galen would like, extending beyond their own bodies and selves to the bodies and selves of others as well. The farmer language thus captures both anxiety over human beings' inflated godlike agency and anxiety over their inability to manage the fallout from that agency. Human parents carry responsibility to cultivate life akin to that of the demiurge, but without his foresight and capacity to work under any material circumstances. They are fallible, forgetful, imperfect creators of their own and others' bodies. For all the trouble it makes, the role of human beings as agential creators of life is actually part of Galen's solution to heredity as a problem of theodicy, to why we have bad heredity in a good world. It's not an accident that Galen's emphasis on the role of reproduction in upholding the good order of the natural world comes in the discussion of animal sexual anatomy, whereas the picture of the demiurge farmer goes hand in hand with the description of human beings as unruly generators. Human beings' rational agency is often a destructive force. It means we mess up things that animals just do according to their own bodies. But it also belongs in the natural world because it's part of the lot of being a rational animal. It's an aspect of human beings' vexed likeness to the demiurge. So briefly to review, in Galen's teleological work, species heredity is one of the most important achievements of design. Below the level of the species, there are errors of the craftsman and variations in connate matter, neither of which pose serious problems of theodicy. But the heart of the problem, what Galen's contemporaries like Plutarch and Soranus understand as bad intergenerational resemblance, systematic material transmission of undesirable pathae as part of the mechanics of reproduction, Galen wants us in UP to understand differently. He wants us to understand it through the heuristic of error and agency. It's a feature of the fact that human beings are rational animals whose reason sometimes miscalculates the moment at which they should conceive or how they should act during gestation. Sweeping up these cases of bad heredity, he reimagines them as cases of human error. So the most extreme solution that Galen offers to bad heredity is to understand it through the lens of human agency, which belongs in the natural world because it makes human beings more like Galen's God. Galen's solution, as you've seen, vastly increases the scope of human beings' responsibility for their future offspring's health and well-being. So as one discussion of this passage notes, Galen suggests that it's humans who are to a very large extent responsible for their own or their children's health problems. So if you think all the way back to the beginning of this talk, in Plutarch, this problem of the transmission of the fault, right, the fact that whatever you feel at conception passes to your child, motivates a sort of sweeping account of how your children end up responsible for the things that you did wrong and liable to punishment for the things that you did wrong. In Galen, the same problem, the problem of heredity, motivates a sweeping account of the way that ancestors bear responsibility for their offspring. Inasmuch as whatever their actions are, whatever their errors are, those errors will affect the lives and bodies of their offspring. In different but related ways, then, for each of these authors, the transmission of fault troubles any straightforward concept of personal responsibility. It forces attention to the fact that human embodiment blurs the boundaries of personal responsibility, implicating human beings in expansive forms of responsibility for the lives, the actions, and even the forgetfulness of others. The material entanglements between bodies produce ethical entanglements between agencies. So there's a really fantastic book on the Greek tradition of ancestral fault and theology by a scholar called Renaud Gagné, and he talks a lot about Plutarch's De Sera as a theological engagement with the problem of ancestral fault in Greco-Roman thought. He doesn't really talk about medicine, though, only in the opening anecdote of the book. And what he seems to suggest there is that modern ideas about heredity are the afterlife of ancient theological ideas about ancestral fault. But what I've tried to show you today is that the situation is much more complex. There's a dynamic exchange between medicine and theology already in the ancient world, giving a shape to something like a problem of epigenetics. And the story of the transmission of fault, unlike the story of ancestral fault, is really a story about the body, about how the body, by the circumstances of its creation and continuing survival, implicates a person in forms of responsibility and obligation and suffering that have very little to do with their conscious actions and everything to do with the actions and lapses of others. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Malina, I'm actually going to have you come back up here. So we are going to have our Q&A portion. I have a couple of questions I would love to hear from you. Does anyone have a question that they would like answered? Deborah. I'll hold the mic.
I have about 100 questions, but I'll limit them to one or two. As you were going through this, I kept thinking, what about evolution? Like how man was an ape? And how does that work within what would have been that structure where the animal was designed perfectly to do what that animal was supposed to do? So I don't know if any of them addressed that in any sort of way, but that's my most pressing question.
It's a great question. So the earliest occurrence of the evolution creationism debate in Greek scientific thought is basically between Aristotle and Empedocles. So Empedocles is a pre-Socratic philosopher, and his idea is something like, I'm going to do it in the crudest terms, but it's something like there are a lot of body parts bouncing around. Some of them end up randomly joined to other body parts. You might get a man-headed calf. Unfortunately, how is life going to go for this man-headed calf? Not very well. That's not a very well adapted body. And so the man-headed calf is going to die out. And by the end, after all these parts have bounced around for long enough, you're going to end up only with combination, like organisms that combine parts that are well adapted. So that's basically an evolutionary theory. Aristotle responds to this and he says, it's not enough. There is no way that we can get to the fundamental good order of the natural world just by like calf heads joining man bodies and the resulting animal dying because its teeth are wrong for the kind of food that it wants to eat. He says we need a more systematic principle of order. We need the idea that there's something within, or there's already within organisms implanted in nature, something that causes them to seek their own appropriate ends. And Galen is basically in the tradition of Aristotelian teleology. And his opponents, the atomists, they're not quite like Empedocles. They're a bit more like Empedocles in that they would kind of want to say, you know, actually the natural world is really like atoms bounced around and eventually they ended up in the only combinations that were stable enough to last. And for Galen, this is like heresy. The natural world must have a designer. There's no other way to account for its complexity and for its good order. So it's an interesting, so that's the sort of story about how Galen is an anti-evolutionary thinker, is a creationist thinker. It is a little more complicated than that because beginning with Aristotle, and you also see this in Galen, you know, something people often say is that they were really great and in a way modern biologists because they believed in functional analysis. So if you ask me like, why does the bird's beak look like this? You're probably not wanting me to say, well, because this atom composed of this matter and this atom composed of this matter joined together. And that's what happened. You're probably looking for an answer about how that beak helps the bird survive in its habitat in some way, right? And so part of what both Aristotle and Galen also are trying to say is they're trying to say, well, in biology, you have to explain things in terms of good adaptation, not just in terms of random matter joining to each other. So yes, there are definitely early echoes of the creationism and evolution debate already here. But it obviously does not fit well with the picture that Galen wants to give in UP, where there is a very involved God who is handcrafting every one of your vertebrae to be exactly right for its position on the spine.
I have to follow up. Follow up to the evolution aspect of it. And I remember somewhere, I don't know whether it was Aristotle, where they actually, from one of them, talk about the gestation period of the embryo, and it actually going from like ontogeny, recapitulates phylogeny. So the embryo goes through all the stages of evolution, fish, mammal, whatever, till it gets to the embryo, which was really incredible thinking that foresaw evolutionary ideas. So is that reflected here as well?
That's it. Yeah, actually, Galen is the right. So the ontogeny phylogeny debate is huge in ancient thinkers. This is like they're really interested in this question, and Galen is in a way he's the strongest believer that ontogeny replicates phylogeny of all of them, because he basically thinks when you're a tiny little embryo, you're a plant, and then you get a little more sophisticated and you become an animal. And then only at birth do you become a human being. And so you are literally going through the stages of evolution into a more complex organism. And yes, it does come into some of the stuff here. They're not the stuff that I was really talking about today about bad heredity, but in fact, the problem that obsesses Galen, which is what actually forms the embryo. And he never was able to solve this question satisfactorily. On the one hand, he really felt like this was a task so extraordinary and complex that God should be directly forming each embryo. On the other hand, he thought it was a little bit impious to suggest that God was forming baby scorpions and baby snipes. And so he sort of didn't want God to be totally involved in formation, but he also felt like, what is the thing in the human body that is intelligent enough? I mean, you study for years to get a basic grasp of anatomy, and yet there's something in human bodies that can form and construct another human body, right? So the problem of formation obsesses him elsewhere, definitely.
Well, very nice thought. Thank you, Mike. Question. As you indicated, that there is a resemblance between sort of the original Greek conception of heredity, the one that shows up in Hesiod on the one hand, and the modern conception of heredity on the other, right? And in one case, it's due to moral considerations, and the other physiological. But I think what they have in common is that they give you a mechanism by which certain traits, mostly in the typical examples, negative traits, persist over multiple generations. Whatever. In Oedipus and his kids, they come to grief because of some obscure curse nobody knows anymore, but works over many generations. The house of Atreus, all that kind of stuff. Similarly, the descendants of Queen Victoria, not all, but a lot of them were hemophiliacs, and presumably they could do nothing about it. By contrast, it seems from the example that you gave from Galen, that the mechanisms that he describes seem to be shorter in scope. I mean, the example of the pregnant woman who drinks too much, and that could be taken from the FDA, right? Pregnant women shouldn't use drugs or drink alcohol or something like that. Does Galen have a mechanism similar to sort of the moral arc of Hesiod, or the persistence of DNA that creates persistence of traits over longer stretches within a family?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And so the basic answer is yes, he does. But so my big point here is that both in the medicine and in the theology, it always ends up being about punishment in some way. Like the kind of fundamental reasoning about why there's bad heredity always involves the sense of punishment. So for Galen, for Plutarch, it looks like basically there is no real distinction, and this is going to be true for tons of medieval thinkers too. Like your mother could be in a great mood at the moment of conception, irrespective of what her temperament was. She could pass to you a joyful disposition, and that joyful disposition could be one of the things that you pass to your children. Or if you happen to have the first bad day of your life on the day of conception, then maybe you're going to pass a morose disposition to your child. But there's really no germline, kind of, people say. There's no... In that way of thinking about heredity, there's no distinction between these kind of passing congenital factors and the fundamental thing that you pass down, which is why they are often more interested in the moment of conception, even than they are in the character of the parents. And there's all this kind of pseudo eugenics, if you will, about how if you get the moment of conception just right, you can really make the child come out just right. Galen is different. He's a little bit harder, in the sense that part of the problem that you're getting the kind of side up in this talk is he does seem to think that there's a difference between the matter that your parents pass down to you. But it looks like that matter can only pass down good things. Because, well, for many reasons, but in part because that matter is the matter that forms you into a human being. It's like the matter that is the cause of the formation of your organs. And so it has to be the right kind of matter for the making of a human being. And so that means that anything that kind of you can imagine, like all the stuff that had to do with the kind of connate matter, that can get passed down from generation to generation to generation. In fact, has a better guarantee in Galen's way of thinking about heredity that will get passed down from generation to generation than in Plutarch's way of thinking about heredity. But it's much harder to see how a bad trait could go from generation to generation to generation in Galen, because actually nothing in that kind of connate matter in the seeds can be really bad for you. It looks like the only way that something can go wrong in your generation is through the error of your parents, your direct parents at the moment of conception or in the moment of gestation. So that's the kind of tension between the two ways of understanding heredity.
So much for agency.
Well, your parents' agency. Not your own. Yeah, not at all your own. But it goes different way, right? So in the case of Galen, your parents have a lot of agency over your life. In the case of Plutarch, well, in some ways less, but okay, the consequence of that is that you're responsible for everything that they did wrong. So it seems like for everyone at the end of the day, generation ends up blurring the boundaries of personal responsibility. It ends up saying,
where the soul is playing a role in all of this. And I wish you would clarify that.
Great question. So Galen is also a little unsure about where the soul is playing a role in all of this. And he famously, in the last text he writes where he reviews his opinions, he's like, the one thing I really never figured out in the course of writing more than anyone else in the entire Greek world was the soul. I really never cracked that one. And basically, Galen seems to have a very materialist conception of the soul. Like he seems to really sort of think that your soul is what he calls your mixture. So the fundamental ratio of the matter that makes you up. And your soul names the psychological characteristics that result from that mixture. And sometimes he gets nervous about that idea. Sometimes he feels like there should be something more to it. But basically, he seems to think that your soul names the psychological characteristics that result from the fact that you're like 50% cold, 50% hot, 40% wet, and 60% dry. For Plutarch, it's much more complicated because he really believes in an immortal soul. And not only that, but he actually believes in an immortal soul that undergoes metempsychosis. So it travels from different bodies, not through heredity, but just is born into a new life and is born into a new life and is born into a new life. But Plutarch also really strong. So all of the sort of stuff in Plutarch is, he also really believes that whatever body that soul ends up in is going to influence a lot of things about your character. And so even if you have a good soul, if it ends up in a bad body and you mistreat that body, well, you're not going to have a very good character. So yeah, both of these people in a way they're really, I mean, the body rules a lot of your ethical and emotional life, even if differently. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So I have a question about the idea or possibility of correction, like correction of substance, correction of behavior, or even correction of soul. I guess I'll cite 3 examples. They're kind of wide ranging, but I wonder if you could speak on it a little bit. So Columella speaks, Roman author, speaks very extensively about agriculture vis-a-vis slave ownership and the way that you can remold a previously free individual to have the types of traits that you would want if you had a plantation or a villa in Italy in the Roman Empire. The second example would be in midwifery and also wet nursing, where the wet nurse in ancient Rome would be someone who would have to physically mold, not just mold in a metaphorical sense, but physically mold the infant child to have the sorts of traits that you would want to see in them, especially boys. And then thirdly, Paul of Tarsus, 2nd century Jewish expert, Messianic Jew who believed that Jesus was his Messiah, also speaks about correcting false belief in synagogues prior to his sort of road to Damascus experience, and being able to correct belief by the application of violence, but nevertheless, the potential for correction and improvement in one's lifetime seems to be floating around. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, totally. Okay. Oh, I have so much to say to this. I need to constrain myself. I'll just say one thing about the slavery thing, which is so big, I could talk about it the whole. So one kind of interesting. Yeah, in fact, I was going to say, ask me about that again when I'm writing the second one on physiognomy. So in the passage, so I mentioned that Galen is interested in this idea of these very rare errors of the demiurge, like when he accidentally causes a person to come to being who has 6 fingers, let's say. And he's interested there, and he's like, well, and he's sort of musing in Method of Healing about whether we should correct those errors or not. And he calls them errors in which there is too much or too little. And then he starts talking about the kinds of modifications that slave traders would have done on slave bodies in order to make them look more like what slaves were supposed to look like in order to sell for the maximum amount of money. So in this idea of like there's clearly in this idea of the correction of the body, I think I suspect that slave trading was one of the big places where they were putting this into practice.
Childhood education.
Yeah. Yeah, and absolutely, yeah. If you're a free child, and probably like bodily modification if you're a slave. So ditto wet nursing. There's this like amazing Alice Gellius passage about this, because if you have this way of thinking where you think, well, any material influence is actually going to be just as influential as the seed of the parents, right, which is the predominant way of thinking, then you should be hugely anxious about wet nursing, right? Because basically that person is going to be having just as large a material influence. That's going to be like a third heredity. Basically, they're going to be giving tons of material influence to the child in its early formative years. And that is basically what you see in Alice Gellius, which is this kind of like, oh, make sure you get the right kind of wet nurse, make sure she's the right race, make sure she has the right character, because that person is going to have an influence kind of tantamount to that of a parent. And ditto, as you know, Galen is obsessed with this idea that the last stage of formation is actually the swaddling after you're born. So yeah, there is an obsession with the kind of, I think, problem of how you correct the body. Do you correct the body? How you correct the soul? Do you correct the soul? But I'm particularly interested in how do you correct the body? Do you correct the body? Because I think there are again moments where he sort of thinks about human beings as people who interact with their own bodies in the same way that the demiurge, God, interacts with matter, except that we're worse at it. Yeah, so a very partial answer to a fantastic question, but
okay, I think we are just about out of time unless there's one last pressing question. Okay, thank you again so much.
Thank you.
This is amazing.
Thanks for the questions.
There's no shortage of cookies, tea, coffee, and fruit. Please eat here, take some home with you. Our next event, if you are all interested, the Center for Interfaith Dialogue is hosting organizing a trip to our neighbors at Columbus Circle at Holy Trinity Church for their Magnificat Vespers on December 8th. If that is interesting to you, you can find it on our website, the interfaith at Emanu-El.org. We also have a variety of other really interesting dialogue groups and events coming up. So please feel free to email us or visit our website. And have a wonderful and safe night. We're going to stick around for a while, ask for your questions. When
I was trying to go on it, it wouldn't let me go on like I would click on it, but it wouldn't let me stay on the site. I don't know. I had a problem this morning, but somebody said,
Deborah, would you mind if I asked you to email me about that?
yeah,
Would you? Because that
yeah,
is a concern that we don't want to have.
exactly.